Thanks, everybody. It is a pleasure to see so many people out on a cold down east February night to hear a little bit about Wabanaki-European relations in Downeast Maine. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint just so you all can see some of what I'm talking about. So can you all see that? Okay, great. Okay, so I chose to cover the period from 1500 to 1790 because essentially it's the least well-known period of Down East history. As I'll talk about in a moment, almost all histories of towns in Down East Maine, with very few exceptions, start with the sort of narrative of the first white child born in town was, fill in the blank. And by that, they mean the first English person born in the area. And as we'll see, there are probably 150 years of Wabanaki-French relations on the coast that are a stark contrast, actually, to the way that the English lived later with the Wabanaki. And I'm going to try to really problematize what it is about the English that makes it hard for them to live with the Wabanaki. So let's go. So just really quickly, I've taught at the College of the Atlantic 27 years. I work with the Island Institute as part of a years-long partnership that we have with the Island Institute. Called the Fund for Maine Islands. I've worked with historical societies up and down the coast. Have also worked with the First Coast on a storytelling initiative. And I'm fascinated by local history because it's our direct connection to these really broader questions of sort of who we are and how we fit into the world. My professional scholarship has been on Native European relations in Guatemala in Central America. For my entire career, I've worked on essentially the evolution of colonial rule in southern New Spain, but also because I teach at the college, I do a little bit of everything. As somebody mentioned in the chat, I do work on the history of apples, and I've worked with the Downeast Cider and Cheese Festival. I do a lot of different things to try to bring history alive. And I basically spent the last 5 years really focused on Wabanaki history because I realized it's so fascinating, so really super interesting. So I call this the Forgotten Centuries because I think people are unaware of the long, deep European Wabanaki sets of relations that preceded the settlement of Down East Maine by English settlers after the French and Indian War. And as I was saying before, the sort of idea that such and such was the first white child born in such and such a town is in many cases just nonsense, because there were French settlers up and down the coast from very early on, and though not well documented, they're basically French settlers up and down the coast from about 1630 onwards, and certainly from the whole period from 1670 to 1760s. This is particularly true for a place like Sullivan-Sorrento, where they're clearly indicated French habitants or settlers who lived for generations alongside the Wabanaki before the arrival of English settlers. And I'll show you a map that documents this from 1734. What I want to emphasize today is I'm going to talk about the Wabanaki approach, the history of European Wabanaki relations, how Native people responded and adapted to the arrival with diplomacy, trade, and engagement, and a kind of pragmatism towards Europeans that is really impressive. They managed really to maintain their sovereignty and control over their land over a very difficult period, resisting a larger and much more powerful force to the south, particularly the English, by allying themselves and building profound relationships with French settlers in a period of coexistence. And that sort of erasure of native power over 150 years, more or less, and the French settlers' presence is fascinating and requires some reflection and explanation. So first off, I'm going to start with a question and a story. The question, and the story is the answer, is where's the closest site where the English massacred Wabanaki people? And the answer is Brooksville in Archimagam, along Egamagan Reach, which Egamagan Reach is a corruption of the Wabanaki term word Archimagam, about 26 miles from Sullivan and Sorrento. And it happened somewhere, we believe, between 1690 and 1704, although the records are quite incomplete. But it is an event in which the English massacred every man, woman, and child in the community, with one survivor. So the accounts from the local Brooksville Historical Society refer to this as the Battle of Walker Pond. And the account goes like this. A punitive expedition was sent out by the whites. It probably landed near South Brooksville, where it captured an Indian who was promised his life if he would show them the location of the village. He led them by a long and difficult way, which kept them traveling all night. They came upon the village just at daybreak. It was green corn time. The Indians had been having a feast and, unsuspicious of danger, were sleeping late with no guard posted. The whites killed them all, except one brave who escaped. So I share this story because I've lived here for 27 years, and I had never heard a story of an English attack on an indigenous village, and I certainly had never heard a story of a massacre in this area so close to Downeast Maine, to where I live. And so last year, the year before, I did a project on the Walker Pond Massacre to see what we could find out, and sort of let some students loose on this project to see what we could discover. The interesting thing is there's no definitive evidence other than these several accounts. There's one other account that was preserved, and it was widely understood. Fanny Hardy Ekstrom, who documented native language and stories in the first part of the 20th century, her father had been told that around Walker Pond you could still find musket balls or in the trees where the battle had been fought. So it was within living memory, but also completely forgotten. And to me, this began a really interesting question about why the forgetting, what it is about the forgetting, and how we can think about that. So I wanted to share that story because it was the beginning of a long process for me of doing some local research, trying to understand some of this. And I wanted just to drop back into the past and sort of start with who lived here. So I'm going to use the term Wabanaki today, but that's a more contemporary term that's actually a product of the period that we're talking about. It's a confederation of native peoples who actually ally themselves with the Ottawa and the Iroquois after 1700. So who lived here before 1700 were people who referred to themselves, or who were referred to as Etchemin. There were eastern and western bands of Etchemin, stretching from maybe as far down as Belfast, further down the coast, all the way out to the St. John's Valley. The Soriquois, which is basically from the St. John's into New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, now known as the Micmac. The Etchemin are now known as Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Penobscots. And then the Marichois, who are from the southwestern region down along the sort of New Hampshire border and out to the western part of Maine. And these are the Abenakis. So basically Kennebec River west. So one of the questions that's really interesting is how long have folks settled in this area? This is a map of all the archaeological sites on the eastern side of Frenchman Bay. As you'll notice, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in Sullivan-Sorrento, or on the western side, and then another 10 or 12 on the eastern side, and then over by Gouldsboro even more. So this region of the upper reaches of Frenchman Bay were heavily settled by native people, and there are literally dozens of native sites, many of you probably know of them, scattered all around the bay. And most of these sites have horizons, archaeological horizons, that are between 3,000 and 6,000 years. And estimates are that native people began to settle this area consistently about 10,000 years ago. So we're going to focus on the period of European contact, just because I'm not a specialist in archaeology. These are basically the changing tribal names over time. The Abenakis, Michiquois, Etchemin, Taratines, and Suroquois, that first group that I mentioned. And over time, due to conflict between Europeans and indigenous people, there's a reorganization of the politics of and the identities of native people in Maine. The Abenakis are made up of the Penacooks, Sacos, Pidgewackets, and Ossipes, and other groups. And by 1700, there's another group called the Almilangans. The Etchemins are called the Etchemini-Canibas by the French. So I don't want to really go into this with much detail, but it's important to recognize that things change on the coast of Maine, and native people have a rich history that is in some ways shaped by indigenous histories and politics, particularly their conflict with the Iroquois prior to 1700. And then essentially reorganization because of the impact of warfare on native peoples. So the contemporary Wabanaki Confederacy really is based on politics after 1700, as the Wabanaki people tried to figure out how to accommodate the English and French and maintain their sovereignty. This is a map by Frank Guélin of the area that we're talking about today. And it's one of the few maps that really shows the ethnic names on a map. It sort of says over here, it says Etchemin y Canibas, which are the Kennebec people and Etchemins. Then it says Suroquois here, and gives us a sense of some of the land that was understood to be their territory. So, encountering Europeans. One of the things that I think is extraordinarily important is, you'll hear a story about Champlain coming along the coast. And I think most people are unaware or have never heard that essentially we believe that Wabanaki came in contact with European fishermen along the Maine coast as early as perhaps the 1480s. By the time Giovanni Caboto, John Cabot, arrives on the coast of Maine in 1497, the Wabanaki arrive at Caboto's boat with furs ready to trade with him. So it's pretty clear that they know that Europeans like furs by 1497. Then as different expeditions come down the coast, get Esteban Gomez in 1524, 25, David Ingram, 1569. There's many more in between here, but I just wanted to give you a sense that by the time, for example, the famous Gosnold expedition comes down the coast, the Gosnold expedition encounters multilingual Etchemin traders, probably from the St. Johns River Valley, who spoke their own language, French and Basque. So there's already, by 1602, a deep connection along the coast, and those Etchemin traders are sailing a European boat. So by the time Champlain shows up along the coast and settles in St. Croix, there's already decades of experience with the Wabanaki and Europeans with trade. And they've even adopted by that point European sailing technologies, languages, and other elements of European culture. In 1607, when the Popham colony is settled, they actually bring back with them two Etchemans who had been kidnapped earlier, the Hamada and Skituaris, who are essentially brought back as guides after having been to England. And I keep thinking, like, man, somebody has got to make a movie about this, because these guys getting snatched off of their homeland somewhere probably around the 1580s or 1590s, and then ending up back in the Popham colony, helping the Popham colony establish itself in 1607. Must have been quite a thing. Then the French briefly settle at Saint-Sauveur, and I'll jump forward to when Baron de Saint-Castine settles over in what is today Castine, about 1670. So that by the time the sort of French and Wabanaki really settle into what I would call a sort of stable alliance, more or less, at that point, the Wabanaki have about 90 years of experience with Europeans. And one thing I'll say, and this is, you may have heard this, or you probably can guess this already, much of their experience actually with Europeans is each time Gomez, Ingram, Gosnold, even Champlain kidnap Indians and take them back to Europe. So by 1608 or so, the Wabanaki have learned to be very careful around Europeans. This is a 1671 map of the coast of Maine. I'm sorry, this is how it was drawn. South is up and north is down. And what you see over here on the left-hand side that says 39, I don't know if you can see this clearly, that is the Mount Desert Island. This is the area around Deer Isle and Eggemogan Reach. And then what you see right running up through the middle of this map is the Penobscot River. This is the earliest detailed map of Downeast Maine in 1671, drawn by Governor Grandfontaine in 1671. It shows on the right-hand side, basically the English colonists down the coast, and then identifies actually this area down here around Deer Isle is the small town of Archimagum, the one that will be destroyed by the English settlers, and the massacre will happen at that little site. So this is really the first time, 1671, when the French are settled in a way that they begin to really reconnoiter the area. They begin to understand where all the indigenous people are. There's been Jesuit presence out in Norojawak along the Kennebec, and French presence on and off, but this is really when you have sort of continuous French settlement. This is a 1734 map. Southwick's map of Penobscot Bay, Mount Desert. It says over here, it says Mount Desert Harbor and Bay with its inlets are very good and navigable for ships and small vessels. If peace with ye Indians, trade is fishing, and good places to make fish on woodland and mountains are upon hand. So it gives sort of an idea that they're coming up here mostly to trade. And I'm gonna zoom in because this is the entrance to Taunton Bay. And you can see on either side of the bay, at the top of Frenchman's Bay, are two houses of French habitants, settlers who were living on the coast in this is from 1734, so this documents their presence around 1720 or so. And you may be familiar with this, a reference to a large Indian town somewhere along the coast, probably between the Union River and Taunton Bay, called Douaket. Archaeologists have not really been able to figure out where Douaket is, but you can see clearly on this map the presence of two French habitants, basically on either side of the entrance to Taunton Bay. So I would introduce the idea that basically the realities of Native people in Downeast Maine and really in New England can be divided between before and after King Philip's, or what's called Metacom's War. It's called King Philip's or Metacom's War. And this is a period basically that after Metacom's War, you have basically a period of coexistence and interdependence between Etchemin and Wabanaki people with the French, many of whom settled among them for most of the last part of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century. The Wabanaki have connections with French missionaries up and down the coast, particularly along the Kennebec, at Castine, and what is today called Old Town, and then down along the St. John's River. They routinely traveled, Wabanaki leaders, sachems they were called, traveled routinely to Quebec, about a 14-day trip up the Penobscot or Kennebec to visit with the governors there. And then French communities that were basically scattered from, essentially from Castine up around the Bay of Fundy. And these sort of elements, the missionaries, the governor, and the settlers, was sort of an axis of power and alliance, intermarriage and diplomacy that really defined how the French and Wabanaki interrelated with one another for about 150 years, give or take, depending on where we're talking about. And the definitive rupture, something that really changes this dynamic, is King Philip's War, Metacom's War in the 1670s, 1675, 1676. Because what it does is it redefines the relationship between the English and the Wabanaki, because the English begin after that to push up against the southern boundary of Wabanaki and to seize land consistently in the period from 1675, 1678 onwards. And basically, the English relationship is then defined from 1675 onwards by ongoing violations of native territory, attacks and kidnapping of native people, and basically nonstop intensification of military pressure. The Abenaki and Wabanaki fight the English consistently throughout the 17th century, trying to force the English to respect native sovereignty and land, but they consistently find themselves outnumbered and outgunned. The English decide in this period, starting in the 1670s, to use bounty hunting and sort of very, very brutal warfare as sort of one of their ongoing techniques of war. And we'll talk about this in some detail. So by the end of this period, the English will basically put a bounty on the head of every Penobscot male, female, and child, dead or alive. For every male, this is the Phipps Declaration of 1755, which he enjoins settlers to embrace all opportunities of pursuing, captivating, killing, and destroying all and every of the aforesaid Indians. This is targeted particularly to the Penobscots. Phipps says, for every male Penobscot above the age of 12 years, that shall be taken within the time aforesaid and brought to Boston, 50 pounds. The annual salary of a teacher was about 60 pounds at this point. For every scalp of a male Penobscot above the age of aforesaid, evidence brought in as evidence of their being killed, 40 pounds. For every female Penobscot Indian taken, or for every male Indian prisoner under the age of 12 taken, 25 pounds. And for every scalp of such female Indian or male Indian under the age of 12, 20 pounds. So this is all-out war, and it begins in 1675. And obviously, this is towards the end of what we would refer to as the French and Indian War. But just to give you a sense of this, a person from, say, down in New Hampshire or southern Maine who would go on these raiding expeditions could come back with 3 or 4 scalps and buy a farm. So it's really an all-out war that has devastating impact. And what it does, beginning with King Philip's War and then moving throughout the 17th century into the 18th century, is bring consistent pressure along the southern border, forcing natives from the southern part of New England up into Maine, and then eventually many of them, the Wabanaki in particular, up into Canada. So the Wabanaki essentially end up as war refugees along the St. Lawrence because that's the only place they can be protected from English attacks. So native conflict is also in the background. One of the things that goes on during this period from 1620 to 1670, prior to King Philip's War, is the Iroquois essentially start what are known as the Beaver Wars. And they begin to try to take over beaver hunting and trapping territories. And they essentially expand westward and northward away from their homelands all the way out to the Great Lakes. And the Mohawks are the element of the Iroquois Confederation that basically will attack eastward. And in this early period, 1620 to 1670, till about 1700, the major fear of Wabanakis actually is Mohawk trading warring parties that would come across northern Maine to the Penobscot or across and down the St. Johns to attack Wabanaki communities along those areas. And so there are numerous places. There's a place on the Penobscot called Mohawk Rips. There are sites where they fought the Mohawks consistently. And one of the more powerful accounts of this is there's a captive named John Giles who's held by the Maliseet along the St. Johns River Valley. And he recounts that basically the Maliseets weren't really afraid so much of the English, they were terrified of the Mohawks. So interestingly, English trade around and Dutch trade around beavers begins to create inter-native conflicts that then drives some of the dynamics of how the Wabanaki find themselves seeking guns in particular to protect themselves from either the English or the French. It becomes sort of an overwhelming existential challenge for them to protect themselves from these raids. In the 1670s onward, the French basically create an alliance with the Etchemin and Iroquois. Baron de Saint-Castine, the famous settler in Castine, marries into Etchemin society, marries the daughter of the local chief in the area, and thereby creates one of the most important diplomatic connections, a family connection, that will basically allow him to trade up and down the coast. And his children, who are half Penobscot or half Etchemin and half French, will go on, some of them, to be members of the Penobscot, one of the Penobscot ruling dynasties. So Metacom's War, I've mentioned this before. Wabanaki, the English, basically are fighting wars attacks up and down the coast. English settlers come up to MDI, kidnap a whole clan of Wabanaki and sell them as slaves to the Azores. What this does is pushes warriors who survive the King Philip's War into Maine, and they join Wabanaki and Etchemin communities and become part of the indigenous communities in Maine. Some of them move up into Vermont as well, and then eventually up into Canada. And this is the beginning for the Wabanaki of their withdrawal from Western Maine and New Hampshire, Vermont, to these missionary towns along the St. Lawrence. After 1700, the Iroquois and Wabanaki basically decide to create an alliance. The Wabanaki, Ottawa, and Iroquois basically from 1700 to 1857 meet every 3 years to reestablish their alliance with one another. And this brings to an end the Beaver Wars that had defined the earlier part of this period. So essentially the Wabanaki approach in these relationships with Europeans was to find peaceful relations, consistent trade at fair prices from whoever would offer those. And what ended up happening in most of the 17th century is that the French again and again demonstrated their capacity to essentially play by Wabanaki rules. And I'll explain that in a minute. The English did not do that, as I will explain. But essentially what the Wabanaki tried to do, which was very, very difficult for them in this entire period, was to try to avoid being caught in imperial rivalries between the English and French. They wanted sovereignty, control of their land, and good trade at good prices. But the Europeans kept fighting each other, and the Wabanaki found themselves drawn in again and again. They tried to strike a delicate balance where Sakam's authority and power really came from their capacity to give their followers gifts. And so as long as Europeans gave the Sakams gifts, they could maintain these delicate sort of egalitarian social structures within the Wabanaki groups. But when that was disrupted, it often caused problems internally within the Wabanaki communities. And internal conflict, particularly in the 18th century, will be one of the reasons the Wabanaki have difficulty responding to English pressure. They're willing to adopt and host Europeans in their territory, but they're unwilling, unless absolutely forced to cede territory. And as English numbers grow in the South, the Wabanaki are basically forced into a defensive position, trying consistently to placate and stall English basically moves into their territory. And they do that essentially by using the French as a counterbalance. So what I'm describing is a period basically from 1620 to maybe 1720, 1730, in which the Wabanaki very skillfully play the Europeans off of each other to further their own interests and try to maintain their sovereignty and control over their land. I think the emphasis on the Wabanaki capacity to maintain neutrality in most of these situations and preserve their relative autonomy over this time period by basically playing, using their diplomatic skills is really, really impressive. And one of the things that I think I would really want you to take home from tonight is this idea the Wabanaki were able to skillfully, using their own diplomatic methods, survive, thrive, and maintain their sovereignty for most of this period. Again and again, these are signatures. They are actually totem signs from one of the treaties that was signed in the 1730s, and you can see the names and their signs. There's a swallow here. There are different signs. There's a hook and a club at the top. Again and again, the Wabanakis tried to use European treaty techniques to cement relationships with the English, and again, the English would break their promises. And so we have a number of these fascinating treaty documents that show us which clans, for example, Caesar Moksosin, who is of the Swallow clan, appears again and again in these efforts to basically placate and pacify relationships with the English. The French approach was quite interesting to this by putting missionaries into communities, and in many cases, the Jesuits were willing to fight alongside of the or accompany the Wabanaki warriors on their expeditions. They demonstrated a kind of thing that was understood to be alliance on behalf of the Wabanaki, that friends or fathers, quote unquote fathers, because they would call the French the great fathers, did not send their children into war without accompanying them. There was ritual adoption. Father Sebastien Raleigh is adopted into the Kennebec clan. Other Europeans, Castine is certainly adopted ritually and intermarries into the clan of Modakawando, the ruler of Ochimaugan. And the way that they worked is actually ended up aligning with Wabanaki ideas of kin and kin-like connections that then built the alliance. And the French were quite skillful at this, particularly because of their willingness to intermarry. As I said before, there are English, French settlers along the coast who are settled permanently. Many of them married into Wabanaki communities at Naskayag Point over on Blue Hill Bay. Permanent residents indicated to the Wabanaki that these people were here and part of their community. But it's very important, the French were never numerous enough to threaten the Wabanaki demographically. So the Wabanaki could host them without feeling like they were going to try to take too much territory. The one downside for the Wabanaki of the French was the French were consistently unable to provide enough cheap and abundant trade goods. The French were always sort of running short. Their trade was focused more to the west. And so the Wabanaki consistently found themselves disappointed in the French ability to deliver goods. And by the 18th century, the French changed their practices and begin to violate some of these basic Wabanaki principles, so that by the 1730s, 1740s, the Wabanaki understand that they basically have to accommodate both the French and the English. So when the English show up in the 1760s, they arrive with hundreds of years of mistreatment and misunderstanding of native social and diplomatic and economic norms. So by the time they finally settle, they settle basically with a known history of basically cheating people at trade, not respecting treaties, kidnapping people, and massacring their communities. So this is not probably very promising in terms of the post-1760s relationships between the English and Wabanaki. But again, Wabanaki are very pragmatic, and they try to create positive relationships with the English as they settle. And like the English, the Wabanaki will do the same with the Americans after independence. But like the English, the Americans are equally bad at honoring their word with treaties. American independence in Eastern Maine is won with Wabanaki allies. And during those struggles, particularly around the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, particularly the Passamaquoddies were very influential and very helpful for the Americans down around Machias and Eastport and this area. And the promises that were made, particularly by George Washington and others at that time, were never honored. And one of the things that I want us to conjure with is why it was difficult for the English to live peaceably with their Wabanaki neighbors. And I'm going to suggest some answers to that question. I think fundamentally the English had a real difficulty treating allies as equals. They were very instrumental in their practices towards Native people, and Native people immediately understood that. And if you read any of the transcriptions of the meetings between British leaders and Wabanakis, the Wabanaki are constantly trying to remind the English that they are equals, not subordinates. And yet these military officers in particular have an extremely difficult time grasping that idea, I think because of their ideas of European superiority. Consistently, they refuse to recognize Wabanaki assertions of their sovereignty and to recognize their lands. So fundamentally, British attitudes of superiority were toxic to these alliances because time and time again, the Wabanaki could see that the English basically did not understand their demands of being respected as sovereigns. And English, unlike the French, seemed to understand little of Native customs and practices and imposed treaties often on the Wabanaki under the greatest of duress. And so by the 1720s, 1730s, were, had created a really negative relationship with the Wabanaki. From a Wabanaki perspective, they came to understand the English as scheming, dishonest, and unreliable. In particular, they complained consistently to the governors in Boston about the English officials and traders cheating them in trade relations. So when the English finally prevail over the French in 1763, the Wabanaki are left without any room for maneuver. This long period of time where they play both sides off one another, they try to gain the trade goods that they need and have come to rely on, they no longer have a counterbalance, and they're left basically at the whim of the English. The Wabanaki will again withdraw to the St. Lawrence Valley because they understand that they're still better protected there than in southern areas. Obviously, the English expel many of the French from Acadia to Louisiana and other places, and begin to take land by force, particularly moving up and establishing a fort on the Penobscot River, which was a violation of all the treaties that they had signed. I would argue that English ideas, which actually they had tested out in Ireland as well, of the sort of superiority of the English and their willingness to engage in brutal genocidal violence, was really novel, historically novel. And it's quite interesting to think about what it was about England, English settlers, and the English colonial rule that allowed them to develop those ideas. And I am actually, since we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to stop right there and see what kind of questions people have, because that's a fire hose. I just delivered a lot of information, and we'll see if there are any questions.
Lots of great additions to the conversation in the chat. I saw a quick question about the spelling of the St. John River. Does that have an S? Was it historically spelled with an S?
Yeah, it was spelled both ways historically, and now it's just called the St. John River, I believe. One person asked, what was the punitive expedition against the Archimagam community that led to the massacre for? English fishermen consistently came up the coast and violated Wabanaki territory, and so they would attack fishing ships, and so that was for an attack on a small fishing shallop. Any questions? It's a lot.
Was there engagement specifically in Sullivan and Sorrento? Were there noted times of engagement?
Yeah, so that's why I mentioned Doaket. In the period of the 1670s onward, there were French settlers in this area, and we actually don't know where that, it was a large community. It is actually granted to the Sieur de Cadillac as his sort of seigneury in Downeast Maine. He lives here in Halls Cove in the 1680s. A lot of this is not well documented, but Doaket is an area that we assume is either the Union River or the Taunton Bay area, with one of the larger indigenous communities in Downeast Maine. So yes, and in 1734, there are 2 habitants that are settled on either side of the entrance to Taunton Bay. And those settlers were almost certainly there for decades. Likely intermarried with Wabanaki communities because that was quite common, and probably very likely engaged in trade with Wabanaki, if not also fur trading themselves. Does that help? Yep.
Also, whatever.
Tony, you want to jump in? Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, greetings from Anchorage, Alaska.
Oh, great.
Appreciate your presentation. I worked with Ed Hinckley back in the 1960s for the state of Maine's Department of Indian Affairs,
Oh, cool.
and know some of the history, but I think what your presentation makes very clear is the Indians' determination right from the get-go to maintain official relationships.
Yeah.
That continues to, it should be important to point out, this continues to the very day.
Yes.
To the fact that you've got seats in the Maine legislature for the Penobscots and the Passamaquoddy that exists nowhere else in the country.
Yes.
But they never, ever stop persisting in defending their interests.
Yeah, and I would say one of the things that I would say is probably very important in terms of making the contemporary connection is their demands for sovereignty and respect for their lands has been like unceasing. Whether or not the state of Maine or the federal government respected that, they have asserted again and again their desire for sovereignty and for protection of their lands. And the Indian Land Claims Act, Land Claims Settlement Act in the 1980s was a remarkable historical assertion that forced the state of Maine to recognize the violation of treaty rights. And it was historic. Both them and the Wampanoag had challenged those in the 1980s. So other questions? Thanks, Tony. Yeah, Donald. You're muted. Donald, you're muted. There you go.
My family is Bunker. They were first inhabitants on Cranberry Island around 1800. And the story we felt was that we cohabited with Penobscot, probably mostly Passamaquoddy. But with the revolution, most of the Passamaquoddy families we knew moved to Deer Island and Passamaquoddy Bay because they mistrusted the Indians. I guess you're sort of reinforcing that, but this idea of migrating back to Canada during the Revolutionary War, when there were many Tories also moving to Canada, is an interesting bundle of threads.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that I say to people that is probably not always welcome, right, is that almost every male settler in southern Maine prior to 1740 probably engaged in the militia in these scalping, bounty hunting expeditions up and down the coast, because basically everybody was in the militia. So, you know, those stories, and I don't know if you know this, people, the U.S. Army Rangers have their origin in these attacks on Indian communities. Benjamin Church, who probably carried out the attack at Archimagam, is sort of viewed as the founder of the U.S. Army Rangers because they were the ones who went out and destroyed villages. And I've thought that probably is not something the Army Rangers talk very much about. Zachary, you want to? Thanks a lot, Donald. You want to jump in, Zachary?
Yeah, hey, thanks for the talk. I'm calling from Fredericton, New Brunswick.
Oh, cool.
Anyway, I had a couple questions, I guess. One involves sources. Have you sort of tried any oral history? I think from presentation, it seems to be mostly archival, but I wanted to throw that out there because I think for me, your talk, especially when you talk about the Phipps Declaration, which was a lieutenant governor of Maine, it really suggests a local settler displacement, not necessarily an official sort of English from the crown displacement of indigenous people in Maine. And it also brings into question the 1725 Treaty of Boston or peace and friendship treaties. And I think you sort of alluded to that history too, because I think there's something to be said about maybe the oral history of the Wabanaki people and the treaty history there too, where the governor obviously didn't see it applying, but perhaps there's a different story there.
Yeah. Well, it's probably worth saying that my journey on this was basically inspired by Donald Soktoma from Passamaquoddy from Indian Township. He has a multi-volume history of the Passamaquoddy people. It's amazing. It has everything that you could imagine of all kinds of historical information. And it had this little snippet about the Battle of Walker Pond. And actually, in terms of oral history, Fanny Hardy Extorm in the first part of the 20th century sat down with Penobscot elders and asked about this story, whether there was a story within the nation, and they confirmed that it was true. But I don't know if anyone's done oral historical work, and I, because I'm working in the 17th, mostly 17th and early 18th century, have not. It would be great to see if there are surviving memories in the communities. So, and my purpose, to be honest, is not to present sort of a exhaustive, highly documented, but just to say, this is really interesting from my perspective, why the English have had such a hard time coexisting with Native peoples, period, but particularly in Maine. I think most people don't know that the American Revolution was at least in part motivated by a desire. They were being stopped by the British Crown from taking Indian lands to the West. And they didn't like that. So they wanted freedom to take Native lands. So thank you, Zachary. Yeah, Dwayne, do you want to jump in? Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Todd, for giving me this opportunity. My name is Dwayne Toma from the Passamaquoddy tribe. And it's an honor for me to be here this evening listening in on this historical presentation. And I think, it's so important to be able to share some of the historical information that my colleague, Donald Soktoma, which we work very closely together. I am the director of the museum at Pleasant Point. So me and Donald are very, very good friends. And, we've tried to educate people on a lot of these components, the atrocities, as well as, the legal infrastructure that supports the oppression and also the suppression, as well as the genocide that's being applied. So that's a continuous battle, and it's an ongoing battle that we continue as you see unfolding currently. So I just wanted to talk just a little bit about historical language, as well as, because the language, it's all built in the language. And I noticed people were talking about the St. John River, and I just want to be real clear that it's called Lustigug. That's Maliseet territory. It's not the St. John River. It's Lustigug. It's built in our language. So our people have inhabited this region according to Bilwak-Ewinwug, which means in our language, it's built in our language once again. And that's, we try to show the utmost respect when we use our language and when we talk and we build relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important to us.
Yeah.
Because we're all inclusive. And we've been trying to demonstrate that since time immemorial.
Yep. So
I just wanted to just briefly talk a little bit and maybe just touch upon the language components and where, this is a deep language and a very archaic, old language. And there is a lot of traditions that have been handed down for thousands of years.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dwayne. Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say the work that you all have done, particularly on some of the traditional stories and traditional songs, has been really inspiring to me. I would encourage everybody, if you haven't checked out, Dwayne, it's passamaquoddypeople.org. Is that the website?
Yes, it's passamaquoddypeople.com.
You absolutely have to check it out. They have these amazing recordings of elders singing songs from 1896, some of the oldest field recordings in a native language anywhere. And they happen to be from the Passamaquoddy. And what Dwayne and others have been working to transcribe these and to understand them. And the language is absolutely critical in that sense. I mean, one of the things that I think is so beautiful about it is the stories, the songs that they tell. There are certain kinds of songs, like a trading song. And basically, I believe, Dwayne, you may have told me this story with Donald. If somebody walked towards your house singing this trading song, it's like, okay, let's trade. And there was this deep sort of ritual dimension of trade, and that you had to, it was not just like an interaction where you got this and you got that. It was this deep social relation. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Yeah, and also just to take it a little step further, Todd, and it's built in the song, and it's also in the language when the song is sung.
Yeah.
And it's like Iba Bejiptonagag away. And in translation, what that is like, look, I brought you something.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dwayne. Thank you. I was going to ask you to sing, but I was a little bit nervous. Thank you so much. You should hear Dwayne sing with his drum. It's absolutely beautiful. So, thank you. And also, just as another thing, so the two museums, one at Pleasant Point at Sipayik and at Indian Township, are amazing. But you should visit both of them. They're really wonderful. So, Raina, are we one more question maybe from Sarah? Is that we have time? Okay, Sarah, final question.
We can buy a museum.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We're just wondering, that the English were like a lot of the other Europeans, the Spanish, Portuguese. They were equally brutal kind of people. Were the French different? And if so, do you think was there a reason or?
Yeah, well, actually, so I love that you asked that question, because that's really the question, right? And I think, so for example, the Spanish were brutal, but they had to live side by side with lots of indigenous peoples, and they had to learn how to coexist with them. The French learned, whether they did or didn't. I mean, one of the arguments, I think, is that they, through their religion, had a much more, they viewed the Wabanaki as Christians as equals. And there's a famous book called The Invasion Within by James Axtell that talks about the way in which English religious ideas, French religious ideas, and native religious ideas made them differently good at converting each other. And Axtell says the English were terrible at converting native people. And I think part of it is the haughty sort of superior ideas that they had about native people. But it's a good question, and I don't pretend to answer it. But it is definitely the all-out warfare that was used in New England then just basically gets spread westward. And I think that it's hard to who was the worst colonizer, but the English definitely, if you were the Wabanaki, they were pretty bad. So, but I do think also the French representatives were Jesuit priests who were sort of Renaissance, trained in the Renaissance. They were fascinated by the native language. And often people who lived along the border learned some of so what you found, I think, is that people who lived among native people almost anywhere came to understand some of the codes and that sort of stuff. So is that?
Thank you. This is fascinating.
Yeah. So Rain, is it okay? 2 more questions?
Go ahead.
Okay, Julie, go ahead. Jump in.
Hi. So I was wondering, I know a lot of a certain amount about the doctrine of discovery, but yeah. Now I can't remember. Was there ever a doctrine of discovery from the French? Yeah.
So, gosh, So I'm trying to dodge this because I'm being pinned down about what I think. The English export their poor to the New World, and the poor in they export people to because there's just no land in England, so they export them to the New World and they start settling and reproducing. And as they reproduce, they need land and they want more land, and they constantly want more land. So at the point when, for example, there were, I was saying, French settlers in Acadie, in the Acadian region, there were maybe 600 to 800 French settlers. And there were probably 8,000 to 10,000 Englishmen in Massachusetts, southern New England. And so one of the things that really drives this is land hunger. And so the English are constantly just pressing up against the borders. And this is the history of the westward expansion as well. So it's not just in Maine. So the doctrine of discovery is important, but for the English, it's much more the doctrine of what they could impose. And so what they would do is they would have these negotiations, and they would threaten the native people, who were at this point not very numerous, that basically they would raise an army and destroy them. And so the Wabanaki were like, okay, don't do that. we can figure something out. And they would sign these treaties, and the English would say, okay, we give our full faith, and then they would violate them. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, what I meant was the French treating the indigenous people more as equals, where the British were so superior. And the doctrine of discovery said, listen, you guys, you British guys, you can take all their land because they're not Christians.
Right.
And you can rape them and etc.
Yeah. I think that's part of it. And I also think that in the case of the French, I didn't emphasize this enough. The French needed the Wabanaki as much as the Wabanaki needed the French, because they just didn't have that many people. And so the idea of recruiting native people to fight these imperial wars, it's quite extraordinary when you think about it. You had English militias adopting an Iroquois scalping technique to fight wars against the Wabanaki, right? And it's like, well, what am I supposed to do with this, right? But yeah, I think there is this, and I think the other thing that's quite important, right, is that the English anti-Catholic ideas, they scalped Father Raleigh. When they captured him, they just scalped him, killed him and scalped him. And so the Protestant sort of nationalism of the English allowed them to treat Catholics as heretics, and so they could just kill them. So it's and both sides were quite brutal, but the English were particularly and persistently so. Does that answer your question? Great. Gary, it looks like you.
I just wanted to thank you, Todd, for a wonderful presentation and joining us tonight. And also mention that you've probably set a record for the most participants we've ever seen at a program, and distance as well. We've had Texas and
good,
but Alaska is a new one. And by the way, we have a son, daughter, and 2 grandchildren in Fairbanks.
Great. Alan, and then Dwayne again. And maybe this will be our last set.
Then Goxedewen, Ulistik Nila. I said, how are you, everybody?
Thank you.
I'm from what you guys call St. John River. It's called we are from the people of the good rivers, Willistic League. And I'm a budding filmmaker, and 2 or 3 years ago, I started researching our premier village was Meductic.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of the raids started from. And we'd go towards the Penobscots and pick them up, or either way.
Yep.
And I'm just harvesting my information now, so I I can't really talk too much about it, but and I just woke up from a nap and I came in late, so I was here earlier.
Yeah. Well,
But-
Alan, you'll know that I started to write a section about the folks further to the east, but Raina said you have to leave time for questions, and so I was like, oh, Maduktuk, I have to leave Maduktuk out. It's great. Yeah, it's great history. That's actually where Mudokawando, who's the great leader down here at Achimagam, that's where he came from.
Yeah,
That's his origin.
I started out it was going to be a 10-minute documentary, but I started reading. My research took me to now it's going to be like a 6-hour documentary, I believe.
Great. Well, let us know when it's ready. That's great. Thanks for joining and adding your
Thank you.
voice. Yeah, Dwayne, you get the last word. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Todd, for having this presentation this evening. I'd like to take it a little step further and start, collaborating, with you on more educational forums. Maybe we can, exchange some emails here and start reaching out to Indigenous people as well in the communities, because a lot of them don't know a lot of this history. So we want to be able to share this, and some of us know this stuff, but we want to be able to, have other people too come in to be able to share, because it's really inclusive here, and we need to share historical. And
Absolutely.
also, we also touch upon the doctrine of discovery, because that's really the legal basis of what this was all originated. So I think really an important component to be able to talk about the doctrine of discovery and have people have a better understanding of the the methodologies and mindset and the legal infrastructure that support that type of document.
Yep. Yeah, and the treaty language too. I mean, as you may have seen, I was showing the signums of each of the leaders, the different clans, and boy, those treaties are absolutely fascinating. They're really fascinating. So,
Wonderful opportunity to educate, as well as you well know, the 1794 treaty was never ever adhered to whatsoever, and that's a significant one that you was addressing earlier. I wanted to touch upon a little bit, but there'll be other times that we can have these discussions. But the 1794 treaty is very significant when it comes to our contribution to the American Revolution. Great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. And thanks Donald and Alan and others for joining us from all over and from the communities. And I'd love to collaborate and learn more and teach more. So thanks, everybody.